Welcome to BBC Parliament's coverage from the Select Committee rooms. The Public Accounts Committee held a session on High Speed 2. The proposed high-speed rail line would link London to Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds.
Right, welcome. You're very far away from me, but let's get going. We've got a lot of areas we want to cover this afternoon, so as per usual I'd be really grateful for direct answers as far as possible and short as far as possible as well. That would help us all. Can I just ask the first question of you, Mr. Rutland? Are the facts contained in the report correct?
Yes, if I have been through the normal process with the Controller and Auditor General of confirming that the facts in the report are accurate.
So why did the Minister say he didn't recognise the figures in the report?
I think there's one particular figure that we were picking up on, the Minister was picking up on, which is the NAO's estimate of what a supposed funding gap in the project would be over the coming years. That is the NAO's estimate. We recognise that that is the NAO's estimate and that it is accurate on the basis of the assumptions the NAO has made. However, it is not the position that the government is actually in relation to the funding of the project.
But the NAO's estimate was based on your figures.
It was based on the figures.
So it wasn't based on figures you dreamt up, was it? So why would you not buy into that? That was an estimate based on the figures you provided to the NAO.
We're not disagreeing that if you make the assumptions that the NAO makes, I think it's figure 10 and the relevant text that you're referring to, if you make those assumptions about rolling forward the Department's capital spending in real terms, the Department's provision for capital spending in real terms, and you add in the profile of capital spending on HS2, you end up with that run of numbers. But the government is not planning public spending on that basis.
Since last week? Well, I don't understand what you're saying, because the assumption, what is different here, you should have challenged that on the assumption of where the government is planning its public spending on transport. What is wrong in the assumptions that are being made in figure 10?
So
what's wrong?
Until last week, the government did not have...
Oh, you're saying you changed your mind last week?
No, could I finish, please? Until last week, the government did not have any public spending plans going beyond 2015-16. Therefore, while there could be a gap in affordability of this kind if you made certain assumptions, the government didn't accept that there was a gap because it didn't have any public spending plans going beyond 2015-16. Obviously, since last week, the position has moved on again. Right. So I think in terms of the particular number that the Minister may have been referring to, I think the 3.3 billion was the one that he had particularly had in his mind. But I can confirm that we went through the normal process with the Controller and Auditor General of reviewing the material in the report for factual accuracy, and we were content to confirm that it was factually accurate.
I'm sorry to quarrel with you, but I will on this one, Mr. Rutland, because actually what the Minister said predated the spending review last week, and he said he didn't recognise the figures used in the report. We all accept that given the spending review there is now a 30% uplift in the amount of money available. We accept that, but that was not at the time of the report. The other thing, the Secretary of State said that the analysis was out of date. What does he mean? What does that mean? Because again, we use the analysis you're using.
Just to revert to the previous point, I think what the Minister said was that we don't recognise that there is a £3 billion deficit or black hole in the funding of the scheme, which indeed was the government's position, because the government did not have any public spending plans going beyond 2015-16. So the government didn't accept that there was a funding gap in the project.
Let me just ask you this: had there not been an uplift in your capital programme in last week's settlement, there would have been a funding gap of 3.3 billion. Would there not? Had there not been more money made available to you in last week's CSR, you would have had a funding gap of 3.3.
If you make the assumptions that the NAO makes in its report by way of rolling forward the Department's capital provision for those years and adding in capital spending on HS2, then you end up with the arithmetic that's given there. But it doesn't mean that there was a funding gap, because the government didn't have public spending plans going beyond.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me as if you're saying there was no funding gap because we didn't have any funding at all. That's right, isn't it? That's what you're saying.
There was no funding gap because the government had not yet set out its public spending plans going beyond 2015-16.
On this bar chart, Mr. Rutland, where you've got the pale blue bar charts, which represent in each year the capital spending in each of those years, which of those pale blue bars are correct in your view, given the CSR that we've now had, comprehensive spending review that we've now had, and which are incorrect?
Sorry, you're asking me which
This
of
is
those
on
numbers...
page 35. Well, I want to know, I'm looking at figure 10, as you suggested we do. It says at the bottom, source, Department for Transport, right? And it goes from 2013-14 up to 2024-25. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 bars spread out over those years. And the pale blue one at the top is High Speed 2. Yes?
Yes.
Right. Are those pale blue segments correct or incorrect? Or are some of them correct and some of them incorrect? And if so, which?
Okay, so first of all, the government has not set out capital spending plans going to 2024-25. It's set out capital spending plans for certain elements of the department's capital programme going to 2020-2021. So that's the first change between the chart and the position as set out.
So I should draw a line between 2021 and 2021-22, and everything to the right of it you have no plans for yet, and everything to the left of it you do have plans for.
I think your question was, what are the differences between figure 10 and the plan set out last week?
But
the first difference...
subject to your answer to my question, which was slightly different from my question, but helpful nonetheless, am I right in thinking that if I draw a line down on page 35, and I make the line to the left of 2021-22, then everything to the right of that line going to the rightwards, in other words, there are 4 bar charts from there, there are no plans yet for those years, but there are for the numbers to the left, in other words, going up to 2020-21. Is that correct?
I'm trying to answer your question about the differences between figure 10 and the plan set out last week. The first difference is there are no plans published beyond 2020-21. That is the first difference. The second difference is that the government has set out capital expenditure plans for certain elements of the department's capital programmes, but not every element.
Which element have they not set out?
We have not. Well, I think it's principally the other row here.
Right, but we're really here to talk about high speed.
Other row is time.
We're really here to talk about high speed too. So it's the pale blue bar that I'm interested in, Mr. Rutland. I want to know if going up from now 2013-14 until 2020-21, the pale blue element is correct or not.
The third difference is that there are some differences in the profile, because we have been reprofiling elements of our spend, including highways agents. For example, the government plans for spending to 2021 include a significant increase.
That's pale green, the highways agency.
Yes, that
Once again, I'm not talking about the highways agency. I'm not talking about the pale green. I'm talking about the pale blue.
I'm trying to, Mr. Bacon, to answer your first question, which is what is the difference between figure 10 and the plan set out last week?
Okay.
And I can only do that if I'm allowed to explain the different elements.
Please
so
finish. I'm sorry. Please finish.
Profiling differences. The differences in relation to timescale, differences in relation to content, composition, and differences in relation to profiling. Some elements grow significantly more than this. In relation to your next question, which is what is the difference between the profile in that blue, the pale blue series at the top, and the profile set out last week by the Chancellor, I'm wary of giving you an off the top of the head answer, to be honest. I wonder whether David has got anything to say on that. It's not massively different, but it may be different materially nonetheless. David?
So if you look at figure 9, the light green and dark green elements there are equivalent to the light blue elements in figure 10.
You mean, as it were, all of it is HS2 on the left? Yeah.
For 15-16, what you have here has been increased to 852 million.
852?
So, For 16-17, it's 1.729 billion.
Yeah.
For 17-18, it is down marginally to 1.693.
Yeah.
For 18-19, it is up to 3.3. For 19-20, it's up to 4.
4 exactly.
Yeah, and for 2021, it's 4.9. It's 4.498.
Okay, but can I just take you back to something? Mr. Rutland, you said that before last week, not all the plans had been determined. And when we pressed you on that, you said the only bit of your plans that had not been determined was the other category. will you accept that the other category is minuscule in relation to your total capital programme? I understand the reprofiling point you've just made.
No, I'm sorry to clarify. Until last week, we had no capital spending plans for the department beyond 2015-16. So until Wednesday of last week and Thursday of last week, we had capital spending plans for the... Actually, we didn't even have 2015-16. We had capital spending plans going to
You have
March.
no commitments. I mean, this is absurd. You must have had commitments from existing programmes going beyond...
Of course.
Okay,
of course,
well,
we
that's
have
what
a
I was trying
tail
to
of
get
existing
at.
commitments, but in terms of a plan agreed with the Treasury, a plan in terms of the
existing
limit...
commitments? What are the... Of course you hadn't signed off the capital expenditure. Where were your existing commitments before last week's CSR?
Well, I'm afraid that's a question I would need to give you a considered answer to, because we have, as you imagine, with a department of our kind, we have many capital
programs. You must have a vague idea.
Well,
how much of your capital programme reflects existing commitments?
It declines quite rapidly beyond March 2015 because road schemes typically don't last more than 2 or 3 years. Local capital programs, again, you have the local majors program, which lasts no more than 2 or 3 years, the tail of commitments. Other local capital programs are not committed. The principal committed, Crossrail is committed, but that is declining rapidly, as you can see from the orange block. The principal committed item is the government's statement of funding available for the rail network, from Network Rail, which runs to 2019. And I'm afraid I don't have the number exactly in my head for the figure running to 2019, but it's of the order, I would expect, of around £3 billion a year. So significantly, that's the principal committed item, the dark blue, not necessarily in exactly that proportion, but that's the principal committed item. Otherwise, the departments, while we want to be able to plan long term, given that the department has historically lived in a framework where we are given public spending plans, including capital plans, only for 3 or at the most 4 years, we have had a pipeline which has been capable of being switched off after 2 or 3 years, with the exception of rail, thanks to the legislative framework of 2006.
Okay, now let's move on to another issue.
None of this attenuates the harshness of the criticisms which were attributed by the media to the department on the report. And those criticisms were that the National Audit Office had made errors in calculations, that its analysis was out of date, that the findings in the report were based on incomplete and misleading statistics, and that they failed to take into account the wider benefits of the scheme. Now, those criticisms were all attributed to your department. Were they wrong, or do you deny them now?
The department's position on the report has been clear. I made my position on the report clear in letters to the
Why were these statements issued then?
Controller and Auditor General, in which I confirmed that so far as the examination of the report for accuracy of factual content was concerned, I was content. I also indicated that I was broadly content with the recommendations. What I was not content with, and the Controller and Auditor General knew this throughout, was the core conclusion, the central conclusion in relation to value for money, which is that the project resting on weak foundations. I did not accept that, and I did not accept that because I did not think that it reflected the very good progress that has been made on the programme in the last 18 months, 2 years, and I thought also it put too much weight on in the overall balance of things. It put too much weight on weaknesses in elements of the strategic outline business case as developed at the tail end of 2011, which underpinned decisions in January 2012. So I thought that conclusion I did not accept. Now, I have to say the Secretary of State's statement when the report came out was very much in line with the letters that I had sent to the Controller and Auditor General.
Do you want to come in on that?
If I may, and I'm going to express myself in reasonably moderate terms. I think that's better. But just to be plain, in the last stage of our discussion about the report, the element of disagreement between us came down to a choice of phrasing as between describing the foundations for the business case as weak or saying that they could be stronger. and I wasn't prepared to say they could be stronger because I didn't think that was a fair summary of our concerns. And I have to say, of course we took account, right up to the minute we published the report, we were looking at everything new that had been produced. But the problem was that nothing had progressed to a point that you could really change that view. The original decisions were made on the faulty information, and since then, yes, we recognise this is a report that looks on balance. And what we said on balance was that despite the department having more recently made considerable efforts to strengthen the business case, which we acknowledge in the report, we felt that none of them, as yet, fundamentally altered our view of the quality of the business case, and that was very clear. I will just, if I may, for 1 second longer, say something about the assumptions we made. We didn't describe it as a funding gap. What we said was, however, looking at all of the department's spending plans, admittedly before the latest announcements, and I quote from our report, the department's spending plans are provisional after March 2015, when the current 2010 spending round review ends. The department has prepared forecasts for what it expects its capital expenditure on high speed to be over the long term, and those with the other forecasts available to us at the time are what we put into our figure. Now, we didn't say any more than this could lead to a funding gap. So that's what a report says. I'm just going to leave it at that. And by the way, based on those figures, it could have led to a funding gap. And our concern about that was to draw attention to it. Now, of course, it's been overtaken by a huge increase in the budgetary envelope.
Okay, let's take that. I take this first session as saying that you stand by the figures in the report, your ministers gave another view, and that's a conclusion we come to on that. Can I delve into the costs a little bit more? Your original business case was March 2010. Between 2010 and February 11, your calculation of benefits reduced by 12 billion. Is that correct?
In relation to reduction of benefits?
The reduction, your yes. Assessment of the potential benefits reduced by 12 billion.
Yes.
So between February 11 and January 12, your costs increased by 1.8 billion because you revisited forecasts on both revenues and operating costs. Is that correct?
I think you're referring to Figure 5, and we were content with the figures in Figure 5.
And between January 12 and August 12, your costs went up a further 0.3 billion, and your benefits went down a further 2 billion.
Sorry, but
0.2 billion.
0.2 billion, yes.
Okay. So in 3 not quite annual assessments, before there's been a spade in the ground, all the costs are moving in the wrong direction. Is that correct? Costs are going up, benefits are going down.
So I will ask David to say a bit more about this, but in the costs of the project are dependent on the scope. And we have been doing, HS2 Ltd has been doing... Is it just
true or not true that over the period the costs have gone up and the benefits have gone down? The predicted costs are up and the predicted benefits are down.
I'm not disagreeing with the figures in Figure 5. I'm trying to provide some explanation of why costs have increased. In particular, most recently, the change in costs last week.
OK, well, let's go to last week, because last week you then increased the budget by about 30%.
Well, we didn't actually have a budget for the project before. No, what we had in relation to Phase 1, as indeed the NAO report itself recognises in para 17 of the summary, is in January 2012, in the business case, we had an early estimate of the cost of constructing Phase 1. An early estimate based on a high-level desk-based exercise. It is in the nature of these projects, as you advance, you will do more work, much more work on what the requirements of the project are, and as you do more work, you will uncover more things and you will refine your cost estimate. And the change between for taking Phases 1 and Phase 2 together the figure of 32.7 billion, which was used in 2012. The change between that and the figure released last week reflects two things, principally. First is much more detailed design work. And the second is because we are now talking about funding rather than estimating costs, a increased amount of contingency, or increased provision for contingency.
I don't understand funding and estimated costs. When you get an authorisation for a project, you put a number by it. I don't know what's the difference between funding, and you think, you know, if you're sitting there as a minister, you think, this is what it's going to cost me. Whether it's a funding or a cost, I don't understand the difference. What is true, it's got gone.
It's the minister, but I mean, what were the figures you went out to public consultation on?
Which consultation?
In 2012. The consultation last year.
2012?
Yeah.
We said, as I recall, that there was a range of...
The consultation was the February 2011
Okay, yeah. So what were the figures you were explaining to the public that the taxpayer, the taxpayer, were going to be paying for this?
Well, at that point, I think, as Mr. Lutton was just explaining, the figures that we were presenting were a central estimate, and the difference.
What were they?
So they were 16. I think at that point it was 16 point, around about 16. I think it was 16.5 billion actually for phase one. We did actually present it in a range. So those were the figures we were presenting. But those
so was it a fair consultation? You were selling something with a price tag which has just gone up by a huge amount. I mean, that doesn't strike me as a fair consultation to the British public and the British taxpayer.
So throughout this process, and as indeed the NAO recognised, we were at a very early stage in February 2011. We're still at a relatively early stage, and the NAO recognised that you expect to see some movement in costs at an early stage in the project.
Why always up? Why not down?
What we did back in 2011 was made sure that we tested the effects on the benefit cost ratio of various changes. So we've carried out sensitivity throughout the work, but you would expect the cost estimates to be refined as we go forward.
Sorry, John.
May I ask, what's a high-level desktop review? Because it seems to me that going from 2011 to 2013, an uplift of 30%, it doesn't seem that high level to me. I mean, how can it be out by such a huge amount in terms of the uplift this year? I mean, what are you satisfied at the robustness of the methodologies you used when you made those estimates in 2011? Because they're very seriously out in terms of what today's budget is.
Well, I think as has already been explained, not all of the uplift is due to changes in the underlying cost estimate. But we had to reflect, our cost estimate reflected the level of design that we were at that time. So what the desk study means is that we had a high-level route design. Essentially, we costed that with unit rates. So, for example, we applied a unit cost per kilometre of tunnelling because that was the information that we had at the time. And we applied at that point about 250 different unit rates. The further work that we've done since January 2012 has allowed us to develop a much more detailed design. So we now have a much more detailed cost estimate. Our current cost estimate is based on about 4,000 different unit rates and allowances, recognising the more detailed level of design that we're now at. So we do have a much more confident basis for our cost estimate.
Can I just draw to your attention that when you gave us the £33 billion figure, you said it had regard to optimism bias?
Yes, we have sought throughout the project to include
Well, it didn't,
allowances.
did it? You were 30% out.
Well, as I said, that was based on, I think, as we've tried to explain, on an estimated central estimate. So a probability that there was a 50% probability that would be exceeded.
Exactly. Can we just expand on this? I think there are two major changes between the January 2012 figure and the June 2013 figure. The first is that decisions have been made to change the scope of the works in various ways. For example, by instead of taking a surface route from Old Oak Common to North Holt, to put the route in tunnel, because that is concluded to be much better, to lead to a much better project with greatly reduced risk of disruption to the central line and also to the North Circular. That is one example of a major change in the scope of the works for very good reasons. And And there are a number of such changes. And the second reason is because instead of, as at January 2012, providing a central estimate with a 50% probability attached for the cost of the works, we have chosen, as we are now moving into a point where decisions are being made about funding, to provide estimates with a 95% probability of not being exceeded. Those two reasons, the changes in scope account, I think, for 6 billion of the 10 billion, the changes in approach to contingency, to put it all together on a much more conservative, cautious and prudent basis, because we are now making decisions around funding, is 4 billion, or just over.
May I just check something? Sorry, pardon me, just to clarify. But the increase in 10 billion of 10 billion applies to the whole route, including the Y route, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't imagine your planning on the Y route is anything like as advanced as your planning on the short phase. So some of it is more accurate and specific, and some of it isn't. Would that be a fair comment?
That's correct, David.
But also we have a higher cash amount of contingency for the phase 2. So in phase 1 we're planning on we are planning on 3.7 billion of contingency at P50 level for phase 2.
Sorry, what is a P50 level?
It's a 50% level of confidence that we're putting on that budget. And for phase 2 we've got 6.5 billion.
Can I just ask you how you got to your 14.4 billion contingency? It's a heck of a contingency.
So on phase 1 you've got a point estimate of 15.6 and a contingency of 5.7.
Now, I understand the arithmetic. Yeah. I'm asking you for the justification for a contingency at this stage of the development. You're telling us you're very certain now about phase 1, taking on board the point the Controller and Auditor General made about phase 2. But on phase 1, what on earth do you need this massive contingency? I'll tell you what this feels like to me. It feels a little bit like the Olympics with its 50% contingency. So you can come in and say, we did it in, but you'll spend way above the estimate, and you'll just say, well, we stayed within budget because we've got this massive contingency. £14.4 billion is one heck of a lot of public money that is being set aside as a contingency in this project.
Yeah. But what the NAO report argues in favour of is having a range of costs, and what we've effectively got now is a range of costs.
Why 14.4 billion? I understand the arithmetic, understand what's going where, but why so much?
What we've said to HS2 Ltd is that their target price for completing phase 1 of the scheme is 17.16 billion. So that is the bottom end of our range of figures. What then happens to that point estimate? The point estimate there is 15.6, and we've given them a 10% contingency on that, taking it up to 17.16.
Giving someone a low range to aim for, but knowing they've got a massive contingency, I would suggest would mean that they will hit the top end of that contingency, if nothing else.
Depends on incentivisation.
It depends on, exactly, as the Permanent Secretary says, depends on the incentivisation that you put in place, and also the controls you put in around releasing the contingency above the 10%.
Can I ask, is that contingency, does that include compulsory purchase orders within it, or is that contained within it? So how are you estimating the CPOs for the second phase? I mean, how can you possibly do that at this stage?
We do a bottom-up. We basically or HS2 Ltd does a bottom-up estimate of the amount of land that needs to be purchased and estimates the cost of purchasing that land. The increased cost of purchase is one of the things on phase 1 that's pushed the cost up a bit, and those lessons have been learned on phase 2 and taken into account in the costings for phase 2.
Could I just go back to perhaps add something? I think you were asking how have we arrived at those figures for contingency? Well, the answer methodologically is for phase 1, there is a very sophisticated, what's known as a quantified risk assessment, which looks at all sorts of variables in relation to the project and makes all sorts of assumptions, or tests all sorts of assumptions about those and the impact of those cumulatively on the cost of the project. Very sophisticated QRA approach, on which we have been using some of the, HS2 Ltd have been using some of the world's leading engineering consultancies, and that's for phase 1. For phase 2, which is at a much earlier stage of development, as the Controller and Auditor General has said, an element of QRA has been used, plus an element of addition of what you referred to earlier, Chair, as optimism bias. But phase 2 is at an earlier stage, so there is inherently more risk.
The system is the fact that all your estimates are so shaky and provisional that you've got to allow a big contingency to cover it.
I think it is important to stress this project, phase 1 in particular, has now reached a markedly more mature stage with, instead of 2% of design work being complete, as at January 2012, I understand around 10% of design work is complete, so much, much more mature, and an immense amount of effort.
Only 10%. Only 10% is complete.
Yes, but uncertainty does not run linearly between 0 and 100%. It declines in a non-linear fashion. And the expert advice I've had is that this, on the basis of immense amounts of work done in HS2 Ltd by their development partner, by the consultancies supporting them, this is a robust cost estimate for phase 1.
Can I ask a specific question about, because what you seem to be saying is you actually agreed with the Chair that costs are increasing because essentially political issues around the need to build further infrastructure as a result of political sensibilities, which we understand. And also, on the other end, there's flawed methodologies in your benefits, which you've corrected since they were first identified. So you agree with the Chair in that respect. Can I just ask specifically, on the second phase, have you factored in the risk that there will also be political sensibilities necessitating changes in scoping for the why? In other words, there might be areas of special scientific or scenic interest, there might be national parks, there might be historic viaducts, Bronze Age sites or whatever, that again will mean that you're having to put aside significant contingency funds in the second phase. Is that factored in?
Well, I'll ask David or Alison to speak to the approach to contingency in phase 2, but just to clarify one point, I don't think it would be fair to say that it is political decisions on the scope of works which has increased costs. The decisions that have been made, for example, the decision to run a tunnel from Old Oak Common to Northolt, or the decision to put a tunnel underneath the M6 on its approach into Birmingham at Bromford instead of having an at-grade, i.e. surface level approach, are well-founded decisions based on expert advice as to the right engineering solution in order to maximise the benefits of the project. And
which weren't identified at the outset?
No, you're right, they weren't identified at the outset. A different view was taken on engineering feasibility. As more work was done, we found that it was not going to be sensible, practical, to run at grade from Old Oak Common to Northolt, for example.
Austin.
I have to say that nothing I've seen in the report or that you've said today has dissipated my impression that here is a policy, a project plucked out of the air so as not to be humiliated by the French in the way President Mitterrand used to do about us having nothing but slow trains in this country. And the civil service and the HS2 are then sent out to find justifications for this policy. That explains all the changes in costings, all the new factors being brought in, all the dredging round for regional development, all the dredging round for 200,000 new jobs around every station on the line. I mean, it looks like you're trying to justify a policy which was plucked out, in principle, out of the air.
I have to say I really don't think that is fair or accurate as an account of the policy. This is really about the future of the railway network in this country. So if you take a step back, look at what has happened to usage and demand for the rail network over the last 15 or 20 years. Essentially, usage has doubled. The volume of passengers, the number of trips made and so on have doubled, and growth continues. Growth has continued even during the recession. If you project forward, even on markedly more cautious assumptions than experience of the last 15 years, what you will find is that our main lines will get increasingly full. The one which will get full first, indeed it is already just about full in terms of train paths. By the mid-2020s it will be full not just in terms of train paths but also passengers, is the West Coast Main Line. And the West Coast Main Line is the single most important artery in our railway system.
Where's the evidence for that? I've searched high and low for the evidence. It's not in the report. Everybody says it's not published. Where is the evidence on future passenger demand?
Okay, I think we could certainly do a better job in exposing that evidence. The new lines study from Network Rail 2009, successive route utilisation studies by Network Rail, including the route utilisation study of 2011.
How far forward does that take us?
If you look at the new line study in 2009, that looks at the gap between demand for rail services and capability on a whole series of main lines, essentially the 5 main routes from the west round to the north of London, from the Great Western Main Line right the way round to the East Coast Main Line. And what it says is that the line which will experience the greatest gap between demand and capacity and the most acute problems is the West Coast Main Line. And there's a very good reason.
I'm just going to show, if you go to the page 21, figure 4, and you look at long distance intercity, that's the evidence, right? And at the moment occupation is 76%. By 2026 it becomes 84%. And by 2033 it's just over 100%. So you can that's the evidence that you agreed with the NAO should go into the body of this report. You can't sit there and tell us there is evidence that there is going to be a lack of capacity when this is the only evidence you've got.
I'm sorry, I disagree. I mean, that is part of the evidence. I've just referred just now to a good deal of other evidence and to the strategic arguments around the future of the rail network and the way in which it will get increasingly congested.
Is the capacity on the main lines. So what we're saying there is it's the commuter services using
I understand it's the commuter services, but that's not what HS2 is about, the commuter services.
So what I was expanding on is, for example, paragraph 2.5. Sorry, HS2 is in part about the commuter services because unless we deal with the capacity issue that we're going to face on our rail network, what we will find is that the commuters will not be able to get into London. They will be left standing at the stations on the southern half of the West Coast Main Line.
But there are other ways of dealing with them. Chris?
That's not the basis of this project. The strategic basis of this project is building up connectivity to support regional growth. What you're doing is admitting there, maybe it's a Freudian slip, that the experience of other countries, which is that often economic activity is sucked into the hub, will be repeated on High Speed 2. Because my question to you is, most of the work, for instance, Network Rail have been doing is about remedial work to improve hubs, local hubs on the East Coast Main Line, for instance. And my question to you is, surely the number one priority is regional growth in the North and the Midlands. It's not about dragging people
We're doing other things in relation to regional growth in the North and Midlands. But first of all, could I just take issue with the claim that the first strategic objective of this project is about connectivity? No, the first strategic objective is around capacity. If you look at paragraph 4 of the NAO's report, the first objective there is about increasing capacity to meet growing demand.
Then why have you not done a comparative study, a detailed comparative study, to look at the top 20 discrete local infrastructure projects which would much more quickly and cost effectively and in terms of value for money assist regional economic growth, connectivity and connections to London, rather than this massive white elephant?
A great deal of work has been done on alternatives. David, do you want to answer this?
There are 3 major reports looking at alternatives. The 2010 Atkins report on London to Birmingham, which looked at road alternatives and 5 rail-based alternatives. The 2011 Atkins report on the
could you
Wye
just say these again? The 2010
Atkins report on London to Birmingham looked at road alternatives and 5 rail-based alternatives. The 2011 Atkins report looked at the wide network, including the Midland Main Line and East Coast Main Line, and broke that down into what we call 3 rail packages. And in January 2012, Atkins and Network Rail responded to the representations made by objectors, such as the 51M group, with what they called their optimised alternatives study. These modelled the capacity increases you could get from incremental improvements to the railway system, and showed that you were unable, despite the fact that they would come to many billions of pounds, to meet the requirements of the HS2 project.
But let's be clear, I'm going to go to Chris because you've already voted. Let's be clear before we leave that, the cost-benefit ratio on all those alternatives was better.
But the overall...
Was better? Just answer the question. The cost-benefit ratio on all those alternatives was better?
On some of the alternatives was better in some cases.
And they all cost much less?
And overall, they did not produce the same level of benefits as HS2.
Yeah, I mean,
and they did not
if you
achieve the
spend
strategic
more,
objective.
if you spend this much, as I understand it, it was 7% of the cost, but the cost-benefit ratio, which must be the key value of money indicator, was better on those than it is on this.
But they didn't.
And they come in quicker.
They didn't meet the
growth.
strategic objectives of HS2 though.
Chris.
Yeah, just I've got a number of questions on cost, but I just want to, on this particular point, could you just confirm which document you use for, do you use Passenger Demand Forecasting Handbook version 4.1 or version 5 for your predictions in passenger demand?
So the Passenger Demand Forecasting Handbook 5 is the version which will be used for the revised business case, the updated business case that will be presented before the hybrid bill is deposited this autumn.
Okay, so version 5 was written in August 2009, is that correct?
Version 5, I don't know when it was first. So the Passenger Demand Forecasting Handbook is a industry-led process, collaborative process led in industry. The department makes a decision as to which amendments to the PDFH, if I can call it that, should be taken on board in the department's methodology. It's not an automatic process of taking those versions on board. And the department's methodology is called WebTag, Web-Based Transport Appraisal Guidance. The department made a decision, what I do know is that the department made a decision in August 2012 to take on PDFH version 5 into its analytical approach, into its methodology. I'm afraid I don't know when PDFH 5 started.
The reason I'm asking is because sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was August 2009. The reason I'm asking is because for the West Coast Mainline franchising bid programme, you were quite happy to use the new version, version 5, but you persist until this day on using the old, obviously very advantageous to you, version 4.1 for HS2. And I just wonder why.
To be clear, we're not persisting in using PDFH version 4.1. Since August 2012, the department has adopted PDFH version 5.
But so far in HS2, you've not used version 5 at all yet.
It will be, or it is being used now in a very extensive body of work, which is updating the business case for submission this autumn. So it is being used, and so far as I know, it's being used on other projects which have been taken forward even before this autumn.
But it hasn't been used on any of these costings or any of the value for money stuff that we're looking at now?
It's principally an issue, as I understand it, it principally affects demand elasticities, and it is being used. We presented a business case in 2012. We are revising that business case in a whole range of respects, of which the change to PDFH is just one, I have to say, and we'll be presenting that revised business case this autumn ahead of submission of the hybrid bill. As to the West Coast franchise, I'm afraid, as I recall, there was quite a lot of confusion, both within the department and between the department and bidders, as to whether PDFH 4.1 or PDFH 5 was the model to use, and I'm not sure that that is an example of anything to be followed.
No, but they did use 5. The point is whether
I think it was used 5 for some respects.
There was an absolute disaster area that West Coast Mainline franchise.
I think it was used in 5 for some respects, but not
according to the
consistently.
NAO, they used 5, didn't they?
Yes.
Thank you. Go on, Chris.
I just wanted, because of the changes in the, I was listening to what statements coming out of the department as well as the chairman, and so maybe to help the committee with its figures, if you could maybe give us the up-to-date figures as of last week's announcement for how much is HS2 going to cost us, including the Y as your estimate at this point in time.
David?
Do you want me to break it down between
No, the total would be great.
Contingency?
No, contingency and then, just contingency.
Well, you give a global figure and then break it down into all its component parts.
So the global figure for Phase 1 and Phase 2 together is 42.6 billion. In addition to that, there is 7.5 billion for rolling stock. The rolling stock includes 1.7 billion of contingency. Okay. Phase 1, the total at P95 level of contingency is 21.4 billion, which includes 5.7 billion of contingency. For Phase 2, the total is 21.2 billion, with 8.7 billion at P95 level of contingency.
Sorry, just looking at, you said 10% contingency on Phase 1. It's more than 10%.
No, that is the target price for HS2 Ltd, so that's the bottom end of the scale.
I wish you guys were honest. So the reality is we could end up 26, we could end up on 27 billion on Phase 1.
Not 27 billion, no, 21.4.
21.4 plus 5.7.
No, including 5.7.
Including 5.7. At what level of probability?
At P95.
Right. So it's 21.4 billion, including how much of contingency again?
5.7. So it's within the 21.4.
Yeah, so doing it the other way around, it's 15.6 plus 5.7 equals 21.4.
This smells like MOD territory.
So it's amazing. We didn't get it. I would have thought for 42 billion quid you'd got a few trains thrown in, but apparently not.
No. So that's 7 billion on top.
7 million. So we're pushing 50 already. I mean, everyone thinks it's going to be sort of 70 or 80 or 100, don't they, by the time you're finished. And that would be the path of the course, given your record.
Okay, Chris, carry on.
I just wondered also, because I haven't been able to find it properly, but most high-speed rails across the world run on subsidy. I just wonder, need subsidising post-construction. What sort of subsidy level is the department thinking of giving post-construction when these things are running?
All of our modelling shows that there'll be an operating surplus, quite a substantial operating surplus for HS2.
Okay, so it's going to be one of the very few high-speed rail projects in the world that runs at profit in surplus.
Yeah, built into our BCR is the operating surplus.
Sorry, Chris, can I just I'm just doing Phase 1, 21.4, of which 5.7 billion is contingency.
Correct.
So the contingency is 30%.
Yes.
Why?
Because.
And you say you're so far advanced, you know the costs. You've got a 30% contingency in there.
But the NAO itself argues in favour of having a range of figures.
I'm asking you why.
Well, we could give you a point estimate at 15.6. That is the point estimate, built up, bottom up, as to what this would cost. But all major construction projects operate at this early stage on the basis of optimism bias and contingency. And that's, the NAO argues in favour of a funding stream being put in place at an early stage so that you can work with industry in order to develop the supply chain, give them the certainty they require to bring costs down. And we all know that we can bring costs down in this country if we work with the supply chain. So the NAO argues for a run of figures. We now have a run of figures, but we're at a very early stage. We're before we've introduced a hybrid
But
bill.
I have to say to you,
we therefore need to have contingency.
At 30% contingency, you cannot then argue that you are well advanced and clear on your costs. I'm sorry, those two statements just don't hand together. I can understand why you want a big contingency, because it gives you greater flexibility. And our expectation, no doubt the public's, will be that you'll spend the lot. But you cannot come in front of us this afternoon and argue that you're much more advanced on cost. You've got 95% certainty on what your costings are going to be, and then tell us you need a 30% contingency.
We have 95% certainty within the 21.4, which allows for the contingency. So it is inherent.
Oh, that's such a complicated.
And is it 95% certainty within the 21.2 billion that's Phase 2 as well?
Yes, but allowing for the fact that is at an earlier stage. So it is not as extensive a QRA process which underpins that. So there is more uncertainty around that, and there are decisions still to be made around route and the station options on which we are consulting.
How do you then say that it's a 95% probability? Because you've just sort of just said that actually it's a lower probability.
On phase two,
I'm trying to explain, perhaps in practical terms, that you can work on the basis of the information you have, and it comes out as a 95% probability. But we have to recognise it is at an earlier stage than phase.
Okay, let me ask you, what's the certainty about the 15.6 or 7? What's the certainty there? You say 95% if you add in 30% contingency. What's the certainty about the 15.67?
The 15.6.
Yeah. What's the certainty about that?
That is the point estimate. That is the estimate in 2011 prices of what this would cost. But if you look at a P50 level of certainty, i.e. you're 50% sure of coming in on budget, you end up with a 19.4 billion figure. P95, 21.4. So it ratchets up. The higher the level of certainty, the higher the contingency.
But my point was merely that when you add the two together, the 21.4 and the 21.2, you're saying that they both have a 95% degree of probability. So the 42.6 that you spoke about at the beginning. But in total, and I know that includes contingency and doesn't include the rolling stock, but the 42.6 that you're talking about, in toto, has a 95% probability of being correct. Yes?
Yeah.
But
correct.
you're saying some of that actually has other things around it, including decisions that have not been made, which means we have to recognise that some of that is at an earlier stage, which means that it's not really 95%.
No, but that's why we've got a higher level of contingency in phase 2 than we do in phase 1. Okay. In phase 2 we've got 8.7 billion of contingency. In phase 1 we've got 5.7 billion.
Amy, and then I'm going back to Chris, then I've got Guido, Ian, Austin.
Very quickly then, what we argue for in the report, and in fairness, what we argue for in the report is as cost estimates become more mature, it is a good idea to have a funding stream, indication of funding stream in place. So I'm not critical of that. However, I do think what's really important for the committee to establish is to what extent having a contingency on the existing cost base and on reasonable variation around it is one thing. Having the possibility of material scope creep, in other words, if it was that there was some really material change, like further tunnelling or anything of that sort, then I take it you wouldn't regard that contingency as enough to absorb something of that sort. Is that right? Is that right?
The contingency would not include major changes in scope, for example, that the Select Committee might require. So if the Select Committee requires an additional station, that is not included in the contingency. If it required 20 more miles of tunnelling, that is not included in the contingency. What we would expect to include within the contingency is more minor adjustment in Select Committee to mitigate environmental impact.
Okay. Back to Chris, Guido, Ian, Austin, Meg.
So just a quick one to finish off on the subsidy question that I asked. I just wonder how you define surplus and what happens to that surplus when HS2 is running at surplus.
So the surplus is defined in terms of the revenue forecasts against the operational costs of running the railway, including maintenance.
Okay, but what happens to that surplus? How does it manifest itself? Is it where does it go to? Does it go back into the department?
That is yet to be decided. It depends on the operating model that you put in place for the railway.
Okay, and just also wondered about how. I mean, so the sums you've given us add up to about, I don't know, a lot per constituency, 75 million, maybe a lot more than that. So it's actually quite of interest to everybody around this table whether they're affected by HS2 or not. It's a big leap of faith. It's almost like Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come type territory. And I just wonder, what other costs are there that you've been thinking about? You're going to ship a lot of people between cities. So has there been an impact assessment on what HS2 will do to the London Underground, for example?
There's been a substantial amount of work about what happens to passengers when they arrive at Old Oak Common and at Euston and the dispersal of those passengers. The actual numbers of passengers arriving on HS2 in comparison to the total number of people being carried by London Underground Limited. I don't have the figure in my head, but it is extremely small. It's
2%. About 3%. High speed 2 has about 3%. to underground passengers at Euston. And I think that the key point at Euston is that there will be overcrowding without High Speed 2. I think the predictions that we had in last year were that there'll be 185% average passengers compared with capacity, and we'd increase that to 191%. So we're adding to a problem that already exists, but we're not the cause of the problem.
And there's a very important interchange between High Speed 2 and Crossrail planned at Old Oak Common, which will provide actually a better way of dispersing passengers travelling into central London for many end destinations than coming into Euston.
And then can I just ask about timescales? Mr. Bacon pointed out the graph in the report. And how the monies announced last week work with your timescales. I think Mr. Prout outlined how there were a lot of money added into each column. So when can we expect to see the first spade in the ground?
Our programme shows us starting work in 2016-17. There are, as you know, in front of the House at the moment is the paving bill that will allow us to pay for certain works before the hybrid bill is through. We'd expect to see some works on Network Rail land in preparation for High Speed 2 before then, some purchase of property, but we'll get underway in 2017, and our programme shows completion at the end of 2026.
How confident are you on that programme timeline?
Well, we've sought assurance from HS2 Ltd and have received assurance in writing from the chairman.
Well, go on then, Ms Monroe. Are you confident you can stick to that timeline?
Well, as David mentioned, our chairman has assured Philip that with the figures that were in the spending review last week, well, this is based on advice he had from the executive.
Quite.
That with the spending review numbers and with, I would say, with the assumption that we get royal assent in 2015, we are confident that that funding and the construction programme that we envisage at this time will allow us to open the railway in 2026.
Can I just add, I think it's very important to understand the assumption is in there that we get royal assent in March 2015.
Yeah, and which is mad. I was around when the first Channel Tunnel rail link, in fact, went through my constituency and probably Jackie's as well. And I can tell you that was, I can't remember, the hybrid bill was 3 years late. And this time round, you're dealing with, every aggrieved person in Hampstead right through every constituency. You're absolutely joking that you'll get it by 15. It's a complete madness. Don't you understand that? It's just unrealistic.
So I'll ask Alison to say a little bit more about what has been done to prepare the way for the hybrid bill in a moment. I think it definitely is a challenging timetable. It is clearly a matter for...
You honestly believe you'll keep to it? You honestly believe it?
It is clearly a matter for both Houses of Parliament and the Select Committee how long the hybrid bill takes. Can I just offer one observation, though, which is you mentioned the Channel Tunnel rail link. I recall the decision being made to proceed with the Channel Tunnel rail link in March 1993. March 1993.
Could be, I can't remember.
Indeed. And the bill, there was then a period of time to prepare the hybrid bill, and then a period of time for the hybrid bill to go through Parliament. The Channel Tunnel Rail Link Act gained royal assent in 1996. We made a decision to proceed with phase 1 of HS2 in January 2012. Against that backdrop, achieving royal assent by March 2015 does not sound wholly unrealistic, but it does depend on how Parliament deals with the bill which the government presents.
When will the government present the bill?
The government said that it will present the bill, aims to present the bill by the end of the year.
Are you confident that you're on track to get the bill out by the end of the year?
An immense amount of work is underway to prepare the hybrid bill. It is a huge undertaking.
That didn't sound like yes.
And we are confident that that timetable can be achieved. It is a very challenging timetable, but we are confident that that timetable can be achieved. Alison, do you want to add to that?
Will you take responsibility if it isn't, Mr. Rotnam?
I beg pardon?
Will you take responsibility if it isn't?
There are a range of factors which will determine whether or not the hybrid bill gets into the House before the end of the year. Of course, I will take responsibility with Alison and with David, who is the SRO, for whether or not it is achieved for factors that are within our control. But there are other factors that are not within our control.
I think one of the things that gives us confidence is if you look at what we have achieved to date, and since the Secretary of State's go-ahead in January 2012, We have done a vast amount of work. We've got leading expertise from around the world in terms of our development partner and also our consultants. And we had set ourselves a target of delivering our draft environmental statement in spring this year, and we did do that according to that target timetable. So we are on course in what we've done, and I think that the work that we presented in the draft environmental statement does give a really good indication of the amount of work that we have done, and shows that we are well on the way.
On that point, Ms Munro, you mentioned your consultants. Which were the consultants who helped you with the calculation that's referred to in paragraph 2.13, which turned out to be wrong, so that 2/3 of the 12 billion reduction was due to errors in the way passenger demand was modelled? Which were the consultants that made that mistake?
This was the original, this was the modelling error in 2010, I think.
I'm looking at the modelling error referred to between March 2010 and February 2011, where benefits reduced by 12 billion. This is the first bullet point of paragraph 2.13. Which were the consultants involved in that miscalculation?
The consultants then were Atkins, who were then our consultants undertaking the modelling on our behalf.
Mr Rutnam earlier referred to the study in 2010, the London to Birmingham 5 rail-based options study. That was undertaken by Atkins, yes?
Correct, yes.
Is that the same thing that we're referring to here in this paragraph?
It's not the same piece of work.
It's not the same thing?
It's not the same piece of work, same firm.
No. Okay, so it's a different piece of work. Mr Rutnam, you said earlier that passenger forecasting was an industry-led process.
The passenger demand forecasting.
Passenger forecasting was an industry-led process.
As I understand the PDFH process, yes.
Right, okay.
But we participate as well.
Right. When you say industry-led, to whom are you referring?
I'm afraid I would have to come back to you on the details of the way in which the PDFH process is run. I think I think that there is a committee, a group of industry professionals who oversee the development of the PDFH.
You'd have to come back. Let's just deconstruct that for a second. You'd have to come back to me on who it is that is leading the process of developing passenger forecasts.
It includes, for example, Network Rail, the regulator, I believe, train operating companies.
You believe?
And the department.
I mean, I would hope these things were pinned down so we knew where we were getting our passenger forecasts from. Because it's not as if we haven't been here before. No. I mean, the Millennium Dome, you may remember, revolved around certain levels of forecasts of visitor numbers. If you look at the Navan Centre in Northern Ireland, it was visitor numbers that went horribly wrong. Passenger numbers do have a habit of being wrong, so I'd like to know, if it's an industry-led process, who it is that's doing it.
I don't think there's any difficulty in coming back to you, Mr Bacon.
What I'm surprised by is that you don't know now, because this is central.
I can tell you that as I understand it, there is a industry committee which comprises the parties that Alison has referred to, Network Rail, the train operating companies. I think it also involves the Association of Train Operating Companies, which is the trade body that coordinates TOC activities, the department, which oversees the development of the PDFH methodology. It's a well-established mechanism, a well-established methodology, and by the way, it also has a good track record of in terms of the relationship between forecasting and outturn.
Really?
Well, not according to the bullet point here in 2.13, it doesn't, because the forecast, the apparent benefits reduced by 12 billion, and 2/3 of that reduction was due to errors in the way passenger demand was modelled.
That was a different matter altogether. That was to do with an error in one of the complex models operated by Atkins for this purpose, which involved an element of double counting, I think, to do with interchange. Completely separate matter from PDFH.
Just get on the record, Mr. Rutnam. Your fantastic ability to forecast. We've had it wrong in front of this committee on the East Coast main line, and we've had it, and that created a bankruptcy which the government had to jump in on. And we had it wrong on HS1, which again created a massive subsidy for the taxpayer on that. But don't look.
I'm not sure that's specifically to do with PDFH, I have to say.
Well, it was
I think one of them
it was the model used to predict passenger numbers was completely wrong.
In one, as I recall, there was overbidding effectively by a franchisee taking on the franchise.
No, it was the wrong. It was a wrong assessment of the number of people who would use HS1.
And in HS1, which we discussed last year, as we discussed then, I completely accept that the assessment didn't allow sufficiently for the potential behavioural response to the creation of HS1.
Well, that's behaviour. That forecast about passenger numbers was wrong.
Can I just finish this point?
There were two different things here. There's the PDFH5, which produces the underlying growth in passenger demand. Yes. And then there's the modelling that we use with those forecasts to identify how many people might use high speed 2. The error was found in how we applied those forecasts and then working out how many people would use high speed 2, because at that time we had to develop a new part of the model.
As we've established from Mr. Heaton-Harris, PDF5 wasn't even used in HS2 so far.
Well, it was the earlier version. It was
the one that gave you more favourable looking numbers.
We've always used the version which is used in department's guidance.
What I was really going to get to was the point I was really trying to get to was this. The industry has an interest in this project going ahead, doesn't it? Because then it gets to build rolling stock, it gets to build track, it gets to employ lots of people, the government pays it lots of money. The industry has an interest in this project going ahead, doesn't it?
The industry is generally supportive of it. I have to say, I think the commercial interests of the operators or the parties in the industry are by no means clear in relation to the project.
Well, there's
not least because it's a long way off. The industry is supportive.
There's a depressingly small amount that is clear, including the strategic case and the benefits case. But let's just leave that for a minute. What I'm really getting at is, you say this process of forecasting passenger numbers is essentially industry-led. You're essentially handing the process of forecasting how successful this is going to be to the people who will benefit from its being constructed, aren't you?
No, not at all. The industry is supportive, first of all, because it sees the strategic arguments which I was trying to outline earlier. We have seen huge growth in rail demand and rail passenger volumes, and the network will not cope if that growth or anything like it continues into the future. The industry recognises that capacity is central to the strategic case for this project. That's the first point.
Of course, Mr. Narutnam, we did discuss this last time when you were here to talk about HS1. Of course they would, because they're not broadband providers, they're train operators, they're constructors of railway track, they like trains, they want more of them. Their interest is that this goes ahead, and you're handing to them the leadership of the process by which you establish passenger forecasts. What you've not put in here is any of the counterfactuals, which I tried to discuss with you last time, and after about 8 or 9 times of asking, finally got from you the admission that you hadn't asked yourself what would happen if you spent £32 billion, for example, on broadband, let alone Mr. Jackson's question about what would be the potential effects, economic and other, on spending this money on a whole series of discrete different projects that would produce quicker returns and higher benefit to cost ratios. We haven't done that, have you? So really, you haven't done that work, you haven't done the counterfactuals, or as it were, the opportunity costs, and you're handing the forecasting of the leadership of the forecasting of the passenger numbers to a group of people who want this to happen.
I completely reject that, I have to say. I do not accept at all that the department is simply handing over to the industry the methodology to be used in appraising this project. The department makes decisions on the methodology to be used. It has a very well-defined process.
You keep on moving it.
It has a very well-defined process for deciding on its methodology.
If it were that well
its
refined,
methodology is internationally respected, and indeed in many ways it leads the standard around the world.
Mr. Rutland, if it were that well defined, it wouldn't have suddenly produced an 8 billion hole quite recently, because the calculations were so bad.
That is not to do with the methodology. That is to do with if you're talking about the error in 2010, that is to do with an error in the application of the methodology, made in fact by a consultant working for HS2 Ltd and identified by our own quality assurance.
Most of our taxpayer constituents will not really care about which £8 billion error you made. They're just distrustful of your ability to get this right, frankly. And you did say that the process of forecasting passenger numbers is industry-led, didn't you?
I said that the process of developing the passenger demand forecasting handbook is industry-led, as I understand it. We then make decisions on which elements of the passenger demand forecasting handbook should be incorporated into our own methodology. Could I just observe, and this is a passing observation, if the industry was so concerned to sort of in your analysis to sort of present the most favourable possible case for HS2. Why has PDFH been revised in the way that it has?
Well, the history of many of these projects is that the goalposts are repeatedly moved until the project gets to the point where it basically can't be stopped. And there's a lot of academic evidence that supports that. And if you want to look at the references, you can read the book that I just wrote that came out a week ago.
In that case, I want to assure the committee of our complete commitment to the best possible objective appraisal of the business case for this project.
Well, good. Chris, let's...
Just one more brief one about the hybrid bill, and then I'll let other people come in, I promise. Figure 12 on page 39 talks about programme risks, and the bill timetable is figures quite highly in that. In there's some eye-catching things like managing opposition to the scheme, including obtaining access for land surveys, minimise the risk of legal challenge. Now, bearing in mind, we all know how, well, actually I haven't got a clue how this place works as Parliament, but in the 3 years I've been here, I've seen things that were dead certs become not dead certs very quickly. Could you provide a note of how your costs will change if the bill is delayed by 1 or 2 years?
Yes, we could. I mean, we could do that.
It would be very helpful if you could.
Just actually, out of interest, isn't that built into your contingency?
The contingency is based on a spot price, not on a funding stream going out over a period of years. So it's a different question.
Well, that adds to my scepticism. I've just got to say to you, I mean, I know you say you'll get you won't get the hybrid bill through in the time period that you've set yourself. It's overly ambitious. You've admitted there are risks, and if you don't, there are then cost implications which will take us beyond the 15.7 and beyond the 5.7 billion contingency just for phase 1. That's what I understand you to be saying.
No, it also actually incidentally has benefits in terms of the BCR because demand is built up if there's a delay in completing the
Well, we'll
project.
come back to the BTR, but you are saying that if there is any delay in the hybrid bill, that will add to your costs. And it's not built into the 5.7 billion contingency on phase 1.
What I'm saying is that we will give you a note on what it will do, which is
Yeah, but that's what you've actually given in evidence to us. Now, I've got Guido, Ian, Austin, Meg, Fiona.
Right, well, I don't want to repeat what's been asked already, but I do want to just quickly go back to the issue of capacity, because as an MP from North Wales, obviously one of the arguments in favour of this is the fact that it will produce regional benefits. But looking at the report and looking at the information being given, and also the increasingly odd messages coming from the department, it's increasingly clear that the department is now saying that this is not an issue about providing a high-speed rail line, it's about capacity rather than speed, because, you know, in an article in the Times very recently, the Secretary of State said that he'd rather call this high-capacity 2 rather than high-speed 2. So the first question I have then is, from your department's point of view then, is this about providing capacity on commuter routes into London, or is this about joining up the country and providing a faster rail link into the northwest and other parts of the country?
So the way I see the argument starts with capacity. So take a step back. The West Coast Main Line is the single most important long-distance route for the country, which serves both our biggest cities. It also carries a large amount of commuter traffic. It also carries over a quarter of our rail freight. So it is a very heavily used, multi-use line. The projections which I talked about, looking at what will happen to our key rail routes when you go forward into the 2020s, show that the West Coast Main Line is the route which suffers a serious gap between demand and capability first and most acutely. So you start the argument with capacity. You then look at a whole range of different things. Could I go step by step? And you then look at a whole range of different ways of alleviating the capacity constraint. And to cut a long technical story short, what you find is that a new rail line is the most effective way of alleviating the serious capacity issues on the West Coast Main Line. It is an expensive solution, but it is by far the most effective. If you are going to build a new railway line, it makes abundant sense to build it as a high-speed rail line, not as a conventional rail line. The incremental cost is actually very modest. The extra benefits you get from building a high-speed line are very large, very large. So it makes eminent sense to build it as a high-speed line. You then add into the argument, if we're going to build a new rail line and a new high-speed line, how can we do this? We're going to commit as a country very large resources to this. How can we do that in a way which will really maximise the benefits that this project can bring to the whole country, bring to the national economy and bring to regional economies? And that's where you get into the objective around regeneration, around regional growth,
yes,
and so on. So that's the story. You start with capacity, you end up with a national project in scale which has the potential to transform connectivity as well as capacity and to spur regional growth.
But looking at the figures, isn't it the case that the capacity issue is all to do with commuter services into London? And isn't it possible, therefore, to argue, when you look at your cost-benefit analysis, which has fallen quite dramatically, the only thing that's keeping that cost-benefit analysis looking positive is the fact that you're classifying so many of the passengers as business passengers who are obviously not going to be doing much work whilst they're on the train. Now, if we're looking at the capacity issue is primarily commuter traffic, I would argue, commuter passengers. And if you classify those passengers as commuters, then the cost-benefit analysis would be affected. So is there some argument in saying that the argument for a high-speed rail link is more to do with getting your cost-benefit analysis accurate rather than the actual benefits that will accrue to other parts of the country?
No, I don't think it's quite like that. So just going to figure 4.
Yes.
The characteristics, and I'm afraid again I'm going to refer to the rail industry here, and the experience of the rail industry over many decades, the characteristics of the commuter market are different from the characteristics of the long-distance market. In the long-distance market, once you start to get loading on trains, which is over 70 or 80%, you start to get people who are actually deterred from rail travel. So there is what is known as a penalty, a loading penalty, because people will either be deterred from travelling at all or they'll find another mode. And as you see, the figures for long-distance intercity loading rise actually to well over 100% by 2033 and would continue rising thereafter, except actually probably what would happen even well before 2033 is that traffic would start being priced off. People don't want to travel on an intercity train which is absolutely jam-packed full. They actually prefer to travel on an intercity train where there is a bit of room for bags and space. So the preferences of passengers on an intercity travel are rather different from the preferences of, well, everybody probably on a commuter train would also prefer that, but the extent to which they prefer it is different. So there is a capacity issue on long distance travel. There is also a capacity issue, if I could just finish, in relation to freight. There would be no more room for freight traffic to grow.
What proportion of your passengers on HS2 will be first class? What proportion of seats? What proportion?
The split between business and leisure is 30% business, 70% leisure in the modelling we've done.
Sorry, 30% business?
And 70% leisure.
And what is it on the current one?
I don't have that information, Alison.
But I imagine it would be broadly similar.
I imagine it's the same. I imagine
on the West Coast Main Line.
Sorry, I don't know, but I should think the assumption comes from current patterns of usage.
Okay. Right.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, go on.
Breakdown is 70-30 in terms of leisure. In terms of the benefits coming through, it's actually the other way around. The benefits primarily come from the business travellers that you are building into the HS2 calculations. Is that not the case? Because on figure 6, it's pretty clear that the economic justification comes from the business travellers primarily.
The value of time in the model, which is not necessarily, in the model, the value of leisure time is much, much lower than the value of business time.
We'll come back to that. I think that's a key point. That is a key point. We need. Do you want to deal with it? No, I'll tell you who I've got on the list. It was just, sorry. It is you, Nick. Do you want to deal with that key point now? Because I think it is a very...
What on this value of business travel? If somebody else wants to come in on that, I want to come back in on the regional issue.
Well, when we last discussed, I'll throw off because I think that is a key point. When we last discussed this, we said to you that the basis on which you assess business travel, so that a business traveller's worth as opposed to a commuter's worth, is totally out of date. And that was one of our recommendations out of our previous consideration of this report. You appear to have gone away and done nothing about it. Although I do notice, if I can find it, I do notice that you published an analysis in 2012, which suggested a downward revision of how you value business travel to 65 to 50% of current values. And I also notice that when you look at the way business travel is valued in other countries, France, Germany, any of these other countries, it's valued at 3 to 4 times ordinary commuter time, whereas we value it much more. Now, all those facts show the more you value the business traveller, the more it looks as if your cost-benefit ratio looks okay. If you were to put a real value on business time, which reflects more honestly the cost of the time you spend on a train, your cost-benefit ratio would immediately look negative, wouldn't it?
Sorry, I thought the Controller and Auditor General wanted to say something.
I only wanted to say, I think we're making reference to 220, paragraph 220 on page 28. And if I may, Chair, what that makes reference to is the fact that there was some work done by the department in 2009 to update the old analysis, over 10 years old. I'm, of course, using old information. But to update that analysis to try to understand better what proportion of train travellers were, business travellers were, they were on the train, they were actually working. And as I understand it, the department discontinued that research because they were finding it too complicated or something. And to be quite honest, we were a bit surprised at that. You haven't thought it right to pursue that strand, and the reason we're surprised is because it's such a crucial assumption, and it's hard to believe that the assumption underlying the estimation basis at the moment, which is that that people don't do any, business travellers do no work, it seems to me that that must be something that injects optimism bias into the benefit estimate. Wouldn't you say that? I mean, whatever it is, it can't be zero. So, as an estimate, it does sound like one which is hard to understand.
Okay, this is a complicated topic, and I think we need to separate two things. There's the methodology, and then there is populating the methodology with numbers. You said, Chair, that you thought we had done nothing since we discussed this issue last year. That is not correct. In fact, we've had an extensive programme of research underway. I think it is referred to in Para 220. One element of that programme of research will be reviewing the numbers in terms of the value that is put on business travellers' time, which at the moment, as I think you know, date from a survey which is over a decade old. So we are seeking to revise that, and I will expect that we will be able to provide new estimates of that, and to provide those as part of the sensitivity analysis around the new business case produced in the autumn. So we are updating the numbers, trying to take account of the most up-to-date information available. That's in relation to revising the numbers in terms of the value of time. You then go back to the methodology. There are a set of issues around the methodology here. It is quite complicated. We are widely criticised for failing, so-called, to take account of the fact that business travellers work on the train. We do make a simplifying assumption in that, but actually we make a whole range of other simplifying assumptions in order to try to arrive at a value of business travellers' time. So, for example, we assume that the value of business travellers' time is the same right the way across the country, everywhere in the country, which is another assumption which could be questioned. We also assume that the value of business travellers' time saved is the same whether it is a very small saving of 1 minute or a saving of an hour. That is another simplifying assumption which could be questioned. We also don't make any allowance for the fact that if you have shorter journeys, you have business travellers less fatigued, and they may not need to stay overnight, for example. So there's a whole range of assumptions we make which are necessarily simplifying. What I can say is we are looking at how we can improve our methodology in this area, but our methodology continues to be on a par with best practice in transport planning administrations around the world. Now, you may think all transport planning administrations are therefore equally at fault, but there is no other methodology out there which is better than the one that we are using.
Because the question is, the reason you get a positive cost-benefit ratio is you put a very high value on business travellers' time. That's the reason. If that were to come down, you'd find that this project wasn't worth pursuing just on cost-benefit issues. You may want to do it for other reasons, but just on the cost-benefit analysis. Now, what you've said to me is that there are simplifications on how you assess business time. They're clear and obvious. I think the argument is, and the argument we had last time, is why you value business travellers' time so much more than commuters. So it's the relationship between the value of business travellers' time to the relationship of a commuter's time, which is wrong. And you haven't done work on that. You haven't built that in to your cost benefit. You may be doing research. You can carry on doing research till cows come home, but to get it more and more sophisticated. But you haven't used any more contemporary analysis than the one that you did on a survey in 1999-2000. And I think that gives you the answer you want. And when you tell me that other countries you're seen best, that is not true. I repeat what I said before. Other countries put a lesser value on business time because they recognise that people working business people on trains now using their iPads, etc., work on trains. And you yourselves, in the analysis that you produced, it may not have been completely 100% accurate, it may have had a lot of ifs and buts, but it's better than what you've got now. What it suggested was that you should revise downwards the worth of business travel to 65 to 50% of current values. Now, if you did that, if you had regard to your research that you've done so far, and if you had regard to international best practice, you would bring that value down, and immediately what you would find is that this is not a value for money project based on cost-benefit analysis.
Well, there's a number of things I would point out in response to that. The first is we are seeking to update the analysis compared to 1999-2001, the date referred to in para 220. So we are looking at more up-to-date evidence which we can use and take account of in the business case published this autumn. So it's not right we haven't done anything. That's one thing we have done. And the second thing is we are trying to review and improve the methodology in this whole area. But as I observe again, this is a very difficult topic, and transport administrations around the world, none has found a better approach than ours. By the way, I have to say I don't think it is plausible that we will end up with a value of time for people travelling on business, which is simply the same as those who are commuting, because people who are travelling on business are travelling in working time. I'm sorry, I thought you were.
Nobody's suggesting that. And I have to say to you, I think the best is the enemy of the good. This is a 1999-2000 bit of research you're basing it on. So far, all your evaluations haven't had regard. We always get promises about the future. So far, your evaluations have not had regard to more up-to-date research. And all I'd say to you is it's a common sense observation, Mr. Rutnam, which you've got to build in. When I was travelling on a train in 1999-2000, it probably was quite difficult for me to work. When I'm travelling on a train today, it's an absolutely glorious, precious bit of time when I can get on with work. It's a complete change in how we lead our lives. And for not to have to regard to that, simply to create an outcome which justifies a project which you're committed to for totally other reasons is what we find unanimous in this committee. Actually, we find really not a good way of you as accounting officer doing the business.
Well, if we're in the realm of common sense observations, may I make two in response? The first is it can indeed be a glorious time in which to work, but only if there is the space in which to do so. If the train is absolutely packed.
Even if the train is packed, I can tell you I've done it in the last 2 or 3 weeks, sitting in an ordinary carriage, with people standing around me, I can use my iPad.
Evidence suggests that business travellers value an environment in which they don't have...
well, they may value it, but they can work in any environment. I mean, that's what I'm telling you. I don't think I'm exceptional. I think I'm just ordinary.
The second observation, which is supported by quite a lot of empirical evidence, including studies of high-speed rail networks on the continent, including just observation of the way in which the aviation market works, business travellers actually are willing to pay quite a bit in order to save a lot of time. There aren't that many business travellers who will travel from Glasgow to London on the train as opposed to the plane, even if they're able to. No, it is relevant. It is relevant because actually, through all this methodological debate, what the economists are trying to capture is the value, or is what business travellers would be willing to pay to travel to save time. That's how it works for non-business travellers, because it's easier there, because you don't have the problem that you've got somebody else paying for the journey, the employer. The methodological problem with the business travellers is that it would be it's the travel and subsistence people, it's the HR department, it's whoever sets the rules about what travel option you can go for.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have one more go and then I'm going to Ian. That's not what we're after. If you've got £50 billion to play around with, and you distort the figures by the way in which you value business travellers, you end up taking a decision to build a project. If you were looking at it a different way, you'd go down the route of what Mr. Jackson says and look at other projects which actually would deliver growth much sooner, and which would come up on your would come up. Or you do the broadband that Mr. Heaton-Harris talked about.
That's where I'd like to come in actually, and you talking to 10 weekly business travellers at the other end of the table here, so it is something we know about. I'd like to go back to the question of regional policy. Is it true that your department has a policy, which the report says on page 7, of rebalancing economic growth? And if so, what does that mean to you? I'm
going to ask David to comment on this, but may I, just for the record, just reject the charge that we are somehow distorting the figures in the appraisal, which I think is a serious charge. And I think you have received a note from our chief economist, which sets out the approach which he, chairing the Joint Analytical Group, has taken to the methodology.
Well, I'll come back to his note, actually, because his note...
David.
So rebalancing growth. Your department has a job to do that. How do you think this project will rebalance growth? And I'm thinking about regional growth here.
Yeah. So the coalition government has a policy to rebalance the economy, and so do we. The question of how this...
Well, what a relief.
So do we, just for the record.
Are you aware of research from the continent that shows that high-speed rail systems tend to pull more activity to the capital city? Are you aware of that?
There's research which shows two things. It shows that economies as a whole grow as a result of transport infrastructure investment, including high-speed rail investment. There's also very good evidence to show that, in particular, intermediate cities between the capital and the endpoints benefit greatly from high-speed rail.
I'll come back to that in a moment. The research from the continent shows that the cities on the high-speed rail line lose economic activity to the capital, but they gain it from the regions around them. That's what the research actually shows. So we will find, as you're predicting, more and more people will be coming to this city itself, which has a capacity problem. Is that something you want to encourage?
Come into the city?
This city has a capacity problem. Schools, housing, everything. We're already talking about Crossrail north to south. There's a capacity problem in London. Do you want to encourage more or less people to come to London?
We don't think that the high-speed rail project will cause London itself to grow disproportionately in comparison to the rest of the country.
Well, different economists then.
Well, I think we're sceptical about that. Could I then move on to another question? Well, let me put it this way: if you look at the 4 biggest countries in Europe, UK, Spain, France and Germany, just look at the rail map. What strikes you very clearly is we have a hub and spoke system around London. They don't. They join up their cities all around the country with good rail lines. Why do we not have a policy to do that? That would really rebalance economic growth.
There's a debate about what the impact of this kind of infrastructure investment would be, but what is absolutely clear at the moment is that the cities of the north, to a city, are clamouring for HS2 to go ahead. Our estimates of job generation are set out in our consultation documents and show a reasonably modest number of jobs on the back of HS2. The work by the core cities and by individual cities in the north of Britain show much greater increase in jobs on the back of HS2. What the core cities themselves say is that in the environs of the high-speed stations, 400,000 jobs will be generated, and in the wider area, up to 1 million jobs will be supported by high-speed.
I think one reason I'm sceptical is I'm not sure how well some people based in London actually even understand the region. So if we take the east and west coast main lines north of High Speed 2, I can see you've got some intermediate stations with that will have high-speed compatible trains. If there was an area the size of Liverpool or Sheffield, in other words, 750,000 people on one of those lines, would you expect there to be a station there? A conurbation of that size, would you expect to have a station?
There is going to be a station at Meadowhall, and Liverpool will have 2 hourly services, 2 services an hour,
okay. But
which will link onto high speed.
But if there was another area on the east or west coast main line of that size, further north, would you expect it to have a station?
Further north than...
Equivalent to Liverpool or Sheffield, would you expect there to be a station on figure 1? Where the east and west coast main line actually passes through.
Would you
expect there to be a station marked on figure 1 if there was an area of 750,000 people sitting on one of those lines?
Would we expect high speed to be extended in due course to Newcastle?
I'm talking about the compatible services that are shown on figure 1.
Yeah.
Would you expect them to stop at the major conurbations?
Yes.
Well, can I ask you, and maybe this is a question for Ms Munro, how much do you know about the Tees Valley and Darlington, where there are 750,000 people who use the East Coast Main Line, which passes through, and is a hive of industry? It's got the UK's second biggest port, and you're saying you're not going to include it on your network. Why would that be?
HS2 services will stop at Darlington.
Well, why is it not shown on this map?
It's not shown on the map, but in the modelling we've done, we show HS2 services stopping at Darlington.
Well, it doesn't give us much confidence when we've got a map prepared by HS2 Ltd that doesn't show Darlington.
Well, apologies for that. We can.
Well, can you confirm that if you were drawing this map again today, you would put Darlington onto it?
I don't see why not. Yes.
Right, good.
Why don't you send us a map? Send us a new map.
Okay, please. Well, at least we've got that.
Any other bids around the table?
Well, I'm sure there'll be others, but it is actually on the East Coast Main Line. Can I also say that this issue, I understand why the northern cities might be clamouring for HS2 to get to London quickly, but they're also clamouring for a lot of other things.
Yeah.
So when I got onto a train to go to Salford for a PAC hearing last week in Middlesbrough, it took me half an hour longer to get to Manchester on that train. No changes, half an hour longer than it takes me to get to London. If you look at figure 1 and see where I'm talking about, which is roughly halfway up that orange line to Manchester, that took me half an hour longer. A few months before that, I went to Sellafield, which is directly opposite the Tees Valley, and it took 4 hours. That did include changes, but that was directly across the small distance of the north of England. And one of the huge problems we have, I think, about the credibility here is there are lots of ways of rebalancing our regional economies which don't involve making it easier and easier to bring people to this place, which is more and more crowded.
But HS2 should not be seen in isolation, and last week's announcement in the spending review made tens of billions of pounds of funding available for transport infrastructure investment over the period to 2021. I think 73 billion available, of which 16 billion is earmarked for HS2.
But it didn't. I understand that, and there were some things around the northern hub and electrification, but it didn't value a businessman's time travelling between Leeds and Manchester very highly, and that is those are two huge centres of commerce. Where there's a vast amount of traffic with an awful rail line. There's no question
could I just comment on this? I'd just like to offer a little bit of hope. I mean, you've mentioned the Northern Hub. There's also the electrification of the Transpennine route, which is planned, which will increase, both of which will reduce journey times and increase capacity between the North East and Liverpool/Manchester.
Still very, very slow. Very slow.
And the other 2 points I would just mention is you talked about connectivity between regional cities. Of course, one effect of this scheme will be greatly to improve connectivity between, for example, South Yorkshire and the West Midlands, also between the North West and the West Midlands. Big benefit. You could regard
but only if you're on the spokes from London.
Can I just also mention the released capacity? So with HS2, there will be a different service pattern on the. We won't need to replicate the services on HS2 on the West Coast Main Line and the East Coast Main Line, which should create new options to serve destinations which presently are off the route, such as Sunderland or Middlesbrough.
Can I just say on the East Coast Main Line, in the last 10 years there's been a 43% increase in passenger numbers, and whilst obviously we've welcomed the reconfiguration of King's Cross Station and some of the work that's envisaged over the next 10 years in terms of releasing the blockages on the line, there is a concern that if the capital is going disproportionately into a West Coast line, that inevitably the East Coast Main Line is going to suffer. And when I asked the Minister in a parliamentary question, there doesn't appear to be any proper scrutiny or analysis of the impact on the East Coast Main Line, other than to say, well, when the second phase is built, it'll be able to reconnect at Leeds. But I mean, that's 20 odd years' time, by which time there's going to be a 1,500 seats deficit from King's Cross suburban services by 2031. I mean, how can you reassure us that you've done the appropriate work to ascertain the impact on other key infrastructure such as the East Coast Main Line?
There are issues about the East Coast Main Line, you're quite right. They are not as acute as the issues about the West Coast Main Line, and of course Phase 2 would help with the East Coast Main Line further. However, in the near term, we also have two other things which are in train, which will also help on the East Coast Main Line. One is the Thameslink programme. So Thameslink services will run onto the East Coast Main Line and will provide a significant increase in capacity for commuters, that commuter traffic into London, certainly as far north as Peterborough. And the second is we are introducing the new Intercity Express programme, which will replace the existing high-speed trains on the East Coast Main Line again. And there are options for lengthening Intercity Express programme trains which don't exist, for example, with the Pendolino. So there are more options. There are issues with the East Coast Main Line. They're not as acute as the West Coast Main Line, and there are more things in train and more options for things that could be done on the East Coast Main Line.
Okay, Austin.
I'm not convinced that the reasons you give for saying it will encourage regional development, particularly in the north, which is what I'm interested in, are not spurious. Why should we assume that a faster connection, half an hour's travel less to get to London, will encourage development in Birmingham, and 3/4 of an hour less will encourage development in Manchester or Leeds? Why should we assume that when the whole of the last century, London, the great Wen, has been sucking talent, has been sucking jobs, has been sucking people, has been sucking industries, has even been sucking my kids down to London? What is there in the high-speed train that's going to reverse that? Aren't we just going to really hear a big high-speed sucking sound amplified by the HS2?
If Birmingham is only 45 minutes from London rather than an hour and 15 minutes from London, there's less need for the industry and for the officers to move to London. It provides greater accessibility for the people who are living and working in Birmingham to be used to to perform functions which otherwise might be performed in London.
But the
if you think of
This hasn't happened in Europe.
and the BBC in Salford, the viability of that project be massively
The
enhanced.
BBC in Salford, there's a decision taken to relocate them in Salford.
But its viability and its ability to flourish will be increased and improved by High Speed 2.
What the evidence shows is that companies in London find they don't need to have branch offices. That's what actually happens. So they shut down their Birmingham office because they can get there and back in a day. I mean, that's the kind of thing that actually goes on in the real world.
And that's what's happened in Europe.
I think there is also evidence of how high-speed rail, though, can actually lead to development. If you look at what's happened around the Lyon Park-Dieu station, that has actually attracted, I think it's something like 800 enterprises have actually developed around the station there, and they think they've attracted about 40,000 employees to work in that area. So there is evidence, and we would certainly accept that you need the right sort of policies to support that. You need to have the connectivity to make sure that people can get to the station, and you need to put your stations in the right place. With the right policies in place, you can actually encourage regional growth.
I love this thing about policies in place. The evidence I looked at shows that, on the Paris study, shows that overnight stays in the satellite areas went down with high-speed rail. And, we've got the announcement today that the French have completely annihilated their high-speed rail programme. It's gone, what has it gone? It's gone from, according to the papers this morning, if I can get my little bit of the French have slashed it from 245 billion euros to 30 billion euros on the basis that they can't justify the cost. So one, they saw a decline in people staying overnight in the satellite town. Two, they seem to have seen the light rather sooner than us and realised that it's a waste of money.
The French, of course, have already completed a very large and extensive network, so I think they're curbing their plans for further expansion, but their network is many, many, many times the size of ours. I was just going to add to Alison's evidence, I would also recommend a visit to Lille, whose resurgence has really been on the back of improved connectivity. And there are towns in Germany where, again, it is often the intermediate towns and cities, as David said, the intermediate cities which have flourished most.
I have to tell you, I'm old enough to remember the story about the city of Lille. The reason the city of Lille has had some resurgence is because they built a station there. It was nothing to do with they just put a station there. If you want your high-speed rail to work, you're going to have to minimise the stations. This was just the one place, the same as Stratford's worked, because they put a station there. I just wish they'd put it in Barking, or maybe even in
There is still a very fine conventional classic rail network station in Lille. It's the new station on the new line which has helped to transform it.
It was a station. It was actually the fact that things stopped at Lille and you had to change at Lille. But do you argue with the research that I've looked at, which says, the research on Paris, which said that there are fewer overnight stays in the satellite town? Do you argue with that research?
I'm not arguing with that conclusion, but I think I've certainly seen studies of that line as well, which shows that actually there has been a development, for example, in consultancy businesses in Lyon. So there are a number of different things going on here, but Lyon has certainly benefited from the high-speed line.
Why are the MPs in Coventry so opposed to high-speed 2? I mean, is it not the case that they feel that they are going to be disproportionately affected, their constituents, businesses, their commuters, by the fact that even if your thesis is correct, the economic activity and regeneration will be in central Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Dudley, Walsall, Coventry will be left behind?
The local authority in Coventry is now in favour of HS2, as is the local transport authority, Centro. I think that the lesson that we learn from looking at high speed around the world is that the key thing is to plan for its arrival properly. And to work with the local authorities to ensure that the right kind of development can take place on the back of the transport infrastructure investment. Now we are lucky because we have 10 years before the first station, or 13 years before the first station is going to open, and we are already working with the 4 local authorities around Old Oak Common, with Solihull up where the Birmingham Interchange Station will be, with Birmingham City Council itself around Curzon Street. We've got a new working group with Manchester to plan for the arrival in Manchester, and we're talking about the same in Leeds. The key thing is to prepare well get the transport infrastructure in place locally, increase the connectivity, and that will maximise the benefits that you get from the infrastructure investment.
Briefly, and then I'm going to bring Meg in.
Okay. Do you want me to just very quickly, just as on the evidence? I mean, we agree. If the summary of the discussion is that there is evidence there's evidence of both things have been discussed. Some redistribution of activity into the metropolitan centre, and some stimulus and not clear what the balance of those. I mean, redistribution definitely, but not clear what the net of all that is. I think our work so far show that the evidence that is available isn't very convincing or particularly substantial in either direction so far. Is that fair comment on where we are at the moment? And does that mean that really to be convinced either way on what the balance of advantage would be, a lot more evidence is required?
I think we've been doing some evidence gathering over the last year. What that shows is what I just said, which is if you plan for it.
Not denying that you've done some. I'm just trying to ask if you really feel that you can place confidence in that yet, or you need more substantial evidence to be able to talk about what the preponderance, not just the positive, but what the preponderant effects might be.
I think you can have confidence that if you plan well, you will benefit from the arrival of a high-speed 2 station.
I don't know what evidence you have to demonstrate that. Meg.
Thank you, Chair. I want to bring it a bit more local to London, if I can, on some of the challenges. And the Chair talked about the hope that you've got to get planning permission through, and I suggest that the area around Euston is going to be one of the big challenges because of the plans there. But could you perhaps start by telling me what was the original estimated cost of the work at Euston?
But when do you original at what date?
When it was announced, when the high speed 2 was announced.
In 2012.
Yeah.
When we made the decision in 2012.
I think it was about I'd have to check the figure. I think it was around 1.2 billion.
1.2 is the figure
It's the figure that is in my mind, but I could check that for you.
And what is the estimated cost of the Euston proposals now?
Well, it has increased. Yes, it's about 1.6.
Right, so it's about 40 million, yes, that's right. Yeah.
It's about what?
40 million.
400 million.
400 million, sorry.
1.2 billion to 1.6 billion.
It's 400 million increase. But am I right in saying that there's going to be, under the current proposals, fewer benefits locally, so fewer flats, fewer jobs and less workspace at Euston than there had been under the previous proposals?
Well, our original proposals actually involved demolishing the entirety of the existing Euston station and replacing it, but also digging out, lowering the platforms. That we estimate would actually cause a lot of disruption during construction and also will cause disruption to the local community. It also, we found it was more expensive than our original estimate. We have since that then looked at an alternative. The alternative we're now proposing doesn't demolish the Network Rail site, so it leaves it at the same level. Apart from that, it delivers all the transport benefits that the original scheme would have provided. We're currently doing work to look at what the opportunities are, for example, in terms of oversight development and development around the station, and also to ensure that it aligns as close as possible with Camden's aspirations, which is set out in their opportunity area framework. So we are still doing the work on the benefits, but we're confident that it can provide the majority of the benefits of the original scheme, and it does cause less construction disruption.
So just to be clear, although you can't pin down, I'm going to imagine there might be 10 or 20 jobs here or there, you can't pin down, you're confident that the benefits that were outlined in 2012 will more or less be delivered?
Well, the majority of them. As I say, the transport benefits, yes. The majority of the other benefits, but we're still doing the work.
When you say majority, do you mean near a 60%, 70, 80? I mean,
the wider benefits in terms of, say, oversight development around the station, permeability through the station, that we're currently, it's difficult to put a percentage on that, but that we're currently working on to try to maximise the opportunities.
These jobs are 20 minutes away from some of my constituents, probably less than that actually, if the wind's blowing in the right direction because of our transport links. So it's important to me to know how many jobs, if you can write to me about how many jobs there are, and not just me but other London members in that part of London. And I mean, obviously that Euston was going to be redeveloped anyway. There was a huge plan to do that, and as colleagues will know who travel through it regularly, it's a very tired station. So what's happening now is this going to be this parallel development, effectively, your bit and the old Euston, but you are working with Camden, you said?
Well, it will be developed as an integrated station, so we're working very closely with both Network Rail and Transport for London, so the new station will be delivered as a unified
And it seems a
whole.
simpler scheme, what you're proposing now, but yet it's going to cost 400 million more. Why is that? Who made the original estimate? I mean,
our original estimate proved to understate particularly the effects in terms of keeping the station open during construction.
So who made that estimate? Was it Atkins again?
Well, it was our consultants advising us. I think at the time it was Arup advising us on the costs of Euston Station. But as we were able to do further work, we were able to understand better the implications of trying to keep an operating station during construction, and that was one of the main reasons why the cost is now thought to be higher than originally.
That's a big jump. I mean, that's a lot of money. We could do a lot of things in my constituency and all our constituencies. So what's the penalty to Arup or any consultant who makes such a big misjudgment? I mean, it's quite an obvious thing to think about how you keep a station running while you're doing major works. I'd have thought they would have, and they're experienced engineering company, I would have expected that they would have factored that in. Clearly, you're saying they didn't. The cost has gone up, even though it's potentially a simpler scheme. And so I'm a bit lost as to what's gone wrong. Who took their eye off the ball at that point?
I mean, it's similar to the point that we were raising earlier in terms of the cost estimate. We've been able to do much more work. We've been able to undertake surveys. We've been able to look in much more detail at how we would actually construct the station, which we weren't able to do originally. And as we've done that further work, we've been able to understand better what the implications would be, and what that has revealed is that it will be more difficult to keep the station open during construction. There are various other things that are more complicated than we originally envisaged, and that has led to the cost being higher than we originally envisaged.
I'm still puzzled as to why some of that wasn't picked up before. But there are other issues there because, of course, the underground is there as well. And we talked about the capacity issues. And I mean, Transport for London's budget is going to be under increasing pressure, Mr. Rutland. Yet all these commuters who are undoubtedly coming into London, and more will be coming in through High Speed 2, will be on an overcrowded tube system that, in spite of investment over the years, because London's growing, will continue to be overcrowded. So again, looking at this money is being spent on HS2, why again that judgment that it's better to bring people into London to fill our already overcrowded tube system rather than giving more money to Transport for London to invest better in our major national cities' infrastructure to cope with the increasing number of people living and working here?
Well, I mean, I think reiterate some of the points we discussed earlier. Firstly, it's very important to understand there is a very important interchange for London at Old Oak Common, with a large new station which would be constructed there, which would serve Crossrail and HS2 and the Great Western Main Line.
So why then are you spending so much money on Euston with Old Oak Common? That's what's going to come to.
Well, so Old Oak Common will provide a very good interchange for many people travelling into central London. Some will, of course, either start their journey or end their journey at Euston. We estimate that the incremental impact on passenger volumes at Euston is quite small, 2 or 3%. Compared to the flow, yes, indeed, quite small compared to the flows already travelling through Euston, or that would already be travelling through Euston. The Transport for London's budget, as you mentioned, is under more pressure now than it was. However, that is principally in relation to the operating budget. The sort of resource budget. The capital budget for Transport for London has been protected in real terms.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure there'll continue to be discussion around how passenger volumes at Euston can be absorbed.
This is not the place to have to do about Transport for London's budget, but I plant my marker. And in fact, I was a former member of the Transport for London board, but that's some time ago. Yep. But just going back to Old Oak Common. There's a whole new terminal that's being built. Well, not quite a brownfield site. Well, it's a brownfield site, I suppose. And it's easier. I'm making a hunch than redeveloping Euston. So why is Old Oak Common not being bigged up more? And what would be the challenges of people finishing their journey at Old Oak Common and coming in then to central London and not Euston? Just could you talk us through the geography of that and what the challenges would be?
We look very carefully at where people want to go to ultimately when they arrive in London or when they're leaving London, and what that showed is that the majority of people actually want to access central London, and for most of them it's more convenient to come into Euston and then change to wherever they're going, particularly if they're going in a north-south direction. What Old Oak Common does is it's very good at providing the east-west journeys. So the combination of those gives a very good offering for the passengers wherever they're going in London. But if you only provided one or the other, you're not providing such a good proposition for the passenger.
I'm fascinated there's only 2 or 3% increase in passengers. So it's a lot of money to pay for just a very small percentage increase in passengers going through Euston.
To be clear, the figures that we've quoted for expenditure at Euston are for the station for the HS2 services. They're not for changing the underground, though there would, I think, be some improvements such as a link to Euston Square tube, which would be integrated into the underground complex. So the 1.6 billion is for building essentially the station that would serve HS2 services to Birmingham and the north.
Can I just go back to this issue about the cost increase? Arup provided advice. You say that they did the best. You seem to suggest they did the best job they could at the time. But is there no penalty to consultants who so badly underestimate? Because it's always underestimation. It's never an overestimation in projects like this. We see it repeatedly at this committee, and this is public sector procurement sort of being outsourced in effect. Well, the advice on procurement's then made on outsourced to a private company that seem to get off scot-free. And I just think that, if you were here, Mr. Rutland, and having made that yourself, we'd be giving you a pretty rough time about making that misjudgment. But Arup are sitting, well, maybe they're sitting behind you, but more metaphorically behind you, I guess get away with making a miscalculation of that magnitude.
I think clearly if a consultant has actually made a mistake, and then we would expect them to face the penalty of that. In this case, it reflected the level of design that we were at when we made the 2012 estimates. So I think in this case we didn't consider that was appropriate. But in other examples, if it was clearly the fault of the consultant, then we would expect them to have a penalty.
And nonetheless, like you, I'm also surprised at the scale of the cost inflation on this item, and I would be happy to provide the committee with a note just explaining why, on our best analysis, why that increase occurred.
I'd be very interested in doing that. Thank
Chris.
you.
Yeah, just on stations again, actually. Your department's developing a new high-speed rail network publication of the 28th of January of this year seems to suggest, and hopefully you can clarify this point, so my constituents go to, I only have one railway station in my constituency, it's called Long Buckby. Very few people ever go there. It's a long line down into London, but it seems to suggest that the service between London and Northampton will have fewer trains post HS2. And other stations which may have reduced service on classic rail to London post HS2 include Coventry, as we've discussed, Birmingham International and New Street, Stoke-on-Trent, Wilmslow, Stockport, Leicester, East Midlands Parkway, Nottingham, Chesterfield, Sheffield, Doncaster and Wakefield. Through services will no longer be able to run from London to Dundee, Aberdeen and Inverness. And 17 stations are likely to have longer time journeys to London on classic rail post HS2 due to the extra stops and route changes. Is that correct?
My understanding is that HS2 could actually bring very significant indirect benefits to Northampton. I don't know about Long Buckby. I know it's the stop beyond, but I think it potentially there too. So if you haven't seen it, there's a very helpful briefing note by Network Rail, specifically on the impact that HS2 could have on Northampton, which talks about the fact that at peak times, trains are already overcrowded. There are typically 125 passengers for every seat in the peak hour. But with HS2, the capacity that could be freed up on the West Coast Main Line could allow up to 6 trains an hour to Euston instead of the 4 that there are at the moment, and up to a 10-minute reduction in average journey times. We'd be very happy to send you the briefing note.
I'm sorry, did you say 125 passengers for every seat?
If I did, then it was an inadvertent slip. My apologies. Is for every 100 seats. There are on average 4 trains an hour into Euston that serve Northampton, but already 125 passengers for every 100 seats on some arrivals.
Horizontally. That you get things wrong by a factor of 100.
I apologise. My apologies.
But what about but I thought the suggestion in this developing a new high-speed rail, I named all those stations. Will they have a worse rail service up post HS2, or will it be better?
A lot of work needs to be done on how the capacity that will be released by building HS2 will be used. But in
developing a new high-speed rail network, document from your department, 28th of January earlier this year, does it not rather suggest that all those places I named will have a worse service post HS2 rather than a better one?
For the purposes of estimating the costs and benefits of High Speed 2, we have to put in place models which show what the services would be like, could be like, on the classic network as well as the HS2 network. In the model that we have, the services to Northampton, and it's only a model, it's there specifically for the purposes of estimating costs and benefits. It shows a reduction in the service to Northampton. But as the Permanent Secretary says, Network Rail have also looked at the potential for release capacity to Northampton, and they show that in the real world, not the modelling world, in the real world, when you start looking at services to Northampton, there'd be a very good case for having a better service.
And so can I just clarify that that model we talked about, the model, not the Network Rail, also means that those also suggested that those stations that I listed would have less service to London on classic rail post HS2.
The model suggests that quite a lot of places will have worse services, quite a lot of places will have better services.
Okay, can I just ask some quick answers because we're getting on? You claimed 100,000 jobs, new jobs. That's in your document somewhere.
It was in the appraisal of sustainability, I think, in 2011.
Is that a net figure? So have you had regard there to jobs lost because of relocations?
Yes. Yes.
You have.
Well, it's net around the station. It looks at the additional jobs that High Speed 2 would encourage around the station.
Okay.
As the NAO recognises, it's actually very difficult to identify where those jobs might have, or would those jobs have gone somewhere else otherwise. It doesn't attempt to do that.
Okay.
So that is a very difficult thing to calculate.
And have you costed the disruption to business of the actual years and years of works? For example, around Euston, if we talk about Euston?
Well, we've made certain assumptions, for example, in terms of disruption to the railway, and we've made assumptions about how much we would have to compensate people, but we've not made any specific calculations in terms of any other disruption.
There is a cost of disruption, which, again, if one's doing a fair, is this a good thing to do, would be a helpful figure. Are you prepared to do that?
Well, the other thing we'd have to reflect in that, and we've done further work on this recently, is we've developed a code of construction practice which sets out how we would seek to minimise effects during construction. So it would need to reflect the development of that, and our aim would be to minimise the effects.
Well, let me take a specific example. You're going to lose some platforms on Euston, aren't you? Currently 16. How many are we going to lose during the construction?
Well, we're planning to, I think the number is 13 that we will have. We will keep. There's an allowance in the numbers for compensation during the construction
You're losing 3.
period.
Is that right? We thought it was 4.
I'd have to check during construction how many we keep going. Ultimately, we have 13 platforms on the Network Rail side.
Busy station, there's going to be some disruption there. There will be a cost to business.
We've made an allowance
at this very high level at which you value business time of your reducing the platforms for a considerable number of years.
You could always alter the value of business time for different parts of the equation. So the disruption had a low value of business time, and elsewhere, do you see what I mean? You could make the numbers look better.
What we've done is use the standard methodology.
No, but you haven't actually valued disruption.
No, we have made an allowance for the disruption to other train services.
You haven't valued the cost to business and commuters.
We will have valued the disruption to the train operating companies, which will reflect the fact that they will lose revenue, and that will certainly capture some, if not all, of the impact on passengers.
Well, hardly.
Do you think you have the right skills? I mean, it was plain from Intercity West Coast, from the Intercity West Coast franchise competition debacle, that there was a skill problem in the department. Now, to what extent has that now been corrected?
Within the department,
yes.
And within HS2, or within HS2 Limited,
with both. I'm talking about the overall. I think public sector capacity. I mean, HS2 Limited is owned by the government, isn't it? isn't it?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, for my purposes, they are taxpayer money, taxpayer funded. I'm really saying, other than obviously the consultants whom you buy in, whom one expects you are paying an arm and a leg for, and one hopes they're expert, although they seem to be capable of getting things wrong. As far as the taxpayer directly employed people, wherever they sit, do you now have the right skills?
My view is that we have the right skills within HS2 Ltd for this phase of the project. As the project moves forward...
For phase 1, you mean?
I mean for the phase of the project that we're in terms of planning and preparation.
What do you call that phase?
Design or pre-setup.
The pre-phase 1 phase.
As we move towards...
So Mr. Ratnam, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I just want to understand, because phase 1, to my simple way of thinking, is the first phase, but you're actually talking about pre-phase 1,
yes, I mean before we actually get into construction. Yeah. So as we move towards... When we get beyond deposit of the hybrid bill, as we move towards thinking about how we are actually going to procure this thing, assuming that Parliament gives us the powers, there will certainly be significant additional skills which are needed in HS2 Ltd. We will be moving towards the delivery phase, and the delivery phase requires a different expanded skill set compared to the design and pre-setup phase, the phase that we're in now.
Figure 12, resourcing, talks about delays in staffing up posts. So what's your vacancy level in HS2 at the moment?
Our vacancy level. I'm sorry, I don't have that number to hand, but we have.
Well, I heard it's 40%.
Well, I don't think that's right.
How many people does HS2 Ltd employ at the moment?
Well, in the company as a whole, we have about 439, I think it is currently in the company as a whole. Now, of that, some of those are people supplied by our development partners. I think 115 are supplied by our development partner, CH2M Hill, and we have a number of secondees as well. So we have some secondees from Network Rail, and we have some secondees from the Department for Transport. And then the remainder are either HS2 Ltd employees, or they're people who are on interims or on an agency basis. Now, some of those are on that basis for good reason, and that we don't need them long term.
But you don't know how many you should have at the moment? Delays in staffing up posts identified as urgent in the corporate plan may undermine the ability to meet priorities. That's what that says. And then it goes on to say...
But I don't think that's talking about our current position.
Isn't it?
Well...
It says add...
Is that about DFT?
Figure 12 refers to the department rather than to HS2 Ltd.
Shall I come on to the department? So HS2 Ltd, as I say, I think they have the right skills for the tasks they have at the moment. We will need to develop the skills with Alison and her team as the task develops in the future. In the department, in the central department, I, with David, have greatly expanded the resourcing devoted to HS2. We've increased to a complement now of target complement of 90, 100.
Yeah. Our target is 100. We'll have 80 by the end of July.
80?
80.
So we have greatly expanded.
What have you got at the moment?
We've got, I think, 5 new people started this morning, so I think we may now have 70.
Sorry?
I think we may now have 70. By any chance? Have you considered locating them out in a regional office?
Because they can get to London, so...
we have some people in regional offices.
We certainly are thinking about the location of HS2 Ltd in the later phases of the scheme. Yeah.
In relation to the central department, so we have, even within the very tight constraints on our resources, I have greatly increased the resourcing. We've also brought David in as senior responsible owner for the programme. I have created 3 director posts beneath David in order to oversee the programme. I would say that we continue to face a challenge in terms of making sure that we have the right mix of skills in the central department, in terms of not just policy skills and the expertise of the legislation, but also the commercial expertise needed really to oversee this programme. Now, the good news is we clearly recognise that and are active in addressing it, but I won't deny that it is a challenge.
Because it says in the same little sentence I'm looking at that there are key risks on legal resources, economists and major project expertise.
It's particularly the major project expertise.
And can I just ask, your 9% cut that you agreed to take in your central resources in 15-16, will that impact on this?
That is in relation to our total resource DEL budget, which includes all the sort of current expenditure.
That. Will it impact here?
And I have to say that the figure which matters in terms of figure 12, and indeed other things we have to do, such as Thameslink programme, is the administration costs limit. I am not expecting a comparable change to our administration costs.
So what, it'll stay at 90?
I have yet, well, we are in the process of just finalising it, but I'm expecting to have, you will be aware of the very significant additional investment in transport which the Chancellor announced last week. We have been very clear that in order to deliver that in an effective and efficient way, we need the resources that correspond to it.
Chris?
I just wondered what your consultancy cost up to date has been.
On this programme?
On this programme, on HS2.
I mean, it varies what sort of consultancy you look at, and in terms of modelling, we've spent about...
I've got a figure of £233.5 million so far.
That's our total expenditure. That's not all on consultancies. So, for example, and since we've been doing this more advanced work on phase 1, which is where most of the consultancy spent has been, we've spent about 150 million, I think, on our professional services consultants who are doing the design and environmental assessment for phase 1. And in addition to that, we have our development partner. We've spent, as I say, about 5.6 million to date on modelling, including our more advanced assurance that we're now putting in place for the modelling.
Just so we, I mean, obviously this is a very early report into what you're doing, but just so we can kind of keep a handle on consultancy costs, could you give us a note on the breakdown of what you've just said? And also, I'm assuming, especially for phase 1, you've got a kind of prediction of where consultancy goes in costs and roughly what time. If we could have a note on that, so, and not to, well, probably to hold you against actually, but just to keep track on how much money is being spent on consultancy here, because obviously, this government, and I'm assuming future ones, are trying to nail consultancy down as hard as possible. I know you need to bring in skills, but equally you're an at arm's length body from the government, and therefore just to kind of check that normal rules do apply to arm's length bodies as well.
Oh yes, I can assure you that we are applying all the norms.
We've got a vote shortly, so I'm just Austin and then Richard.
Well, I'm afraid you've not dispelled my impression that the prospects of development you're holding out for the north from a high-speed train are anything but a con to con we poor northern peasants into believing we shall get some crumbs off yet another project which will primarily benefit London. I'd just like to put it this way: what's in it for Grimsby? Here we are, the Queen of the North. We have no direct service to London because there aren't any slots available on the East Coast line. We don't even now have a connection to Doncaster because a spoiler heap has spilled over the track and buckled it. The heavy goods traffic from Immingham, which is the major heavy goods port of the country, is breaking down the heavy goods transit, so a lot of it is having to go by rail, and there seems to be no prospect for Grimsby now. All those problems are now, and we're asked to hold out prospects of a glowing development from Leeds in 2034, which is well beyond the 15 years I expect to carry on representing Grimsby to fight for development for this benighted town. So what's in it for Grimsby?
I can't make any promises for Grimsby. What I can say is that the fact that there will be services on HS2 that no longer need to be on the East Coast Main Line, that don't need to be replicated there, will mean there's capacity that's freed up, which should mean that it will be possible to start serving better destinations which presently don't get served off the East Coast Main Line. We talked about Middlesbrough earlier. I mentioned Sunderland. You could mention
Why can't that be done now?
You could mention Hull, because the East Coast Main Line is essentially full in terms of train paths, or very close to full in terms of train paths. So there isn't the spare capacity to do that. But if we move services off the East Coast Main Line, some services from Leeds, for example, off the East Coast Main Line onto HS2, then train operators will be able to go out and start thinking about how can they serve markets like Lincoln or Hull, possibly Grimsby, which are presently not served that well at the moment.
Austin, I just want to get Jackie in because there's a vote about her.
This is relevant to Austin's point, actually. If you look at this map, I mean, this bit, the eastern region here, that's really the powerhouse of the British economy. That's the biggest net contributor. And what Austin's just alluded to, I mean, one of the reasons why you've got a capacity problem is the amount of freight that you're wanting to transport by rail. And all our ports are along that eastern coast. So, I mean, this isn't your fault because this is very much a political decision rather than one which is designed to deliver the outcome, which is getting the best out of our capacity. But really, aren't we missing a trick by really putting the investment where the economic activity is?
We did look, or my predecessors with the experts at the time, did look at whether the East Coast Main Line or the West Coast Main Line should be the higher priority. The evidence pointed to the West Coast Main Line. I would say that actually there's a huge amount of freight goes on the West Coast Main Line, and about a quarter of all freight, and a lot of that starts in Felixstowe, some of it starts in Immingham.
And some of it was starting in London Gateway.
And some of it does indeed start Tilbury or London Gateway. Building this route, which, bear in mind, will be the other thing we didn't bring out earlier, it will be effectively a sort of segregated route. It will be dedicated to high-speed services, which is far more efficient in a railway operational sense than having a mixed-use railway where you have slow freight trains having to be accommodated alongside intercity expresses. So there will be gains significant gains in terms of freight capacity.
But only on the West Coast?
No, the gains will spill over onto the East Coast as well.
How much have you spent to date on all this?
We're spending £370 million this year. I'm afraid I don't have a figure.
To date, High Speed 2 Limited has spent, I think it's £234 million.
£374 million?
It's 234 million until the end of the last financial year.
And that's HS2, it doesn't count your departmental costs, does it?
Departmental costs are lower than HS2 by quite a large factor. We have a capital budget for property purchase and the admin budget is quite small.
Okay, thank you. This is the first. We're going to keep coming back to this, Mr. Rotnam, and it will be a rigorous, as it has been this afternoon. But thank you for answering our questions.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you again probably in a year's time.
Okay.
On this one, we'll see you before or after.